Growing up, our house felt like a military camp. My father, a college teacher, ran things very strictly. My older sister Julie was the perfect child, obedient, focused on school, and always trying to make everyone happy. I was the opposite, always testing the limits. Laura, sit up straight. My father would snap during dinner. A lady doesn't slouch. I'd roll my eyes, sit up, and then slouch again the moment he wasn't looking. It was a constant power struggle. My mother didn't say much, but she was just as strict. She would give me disapproving looks at my clothes or the friends I chose. "What will the neighbors think?" she would always ask. Even though home felt stifling, I found small ways to create my own space. I started dating Paul when I was 17. He was 20 and in college. Everything my parents wouldn't want for me. We kept it secret, meeting whenever we could. For a while, I felt like things were finally going my way. I had plans to go to college and escape my parents' strict hold. But life had other plans. A few months after my 19th birthday, I started feeling sick in the mornings. At first, I thought it was stress from my upcoming exams, but soon I couldn't ignore it anymore. I still remember standing in a small gas station bathroom, holding a plastic pregnancy test in my shaky hands. One pink line appeared, positive. I was pregnant. The next few days felt like a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about what to do. I knew I had to tell Paul, but every time I tried to call him, I lost my nerve. Finally, I couldn't avoid it any longer. We met at our usual spot, a small park away from everyone's eyes. Paul smiled when he saw me, but his smile quickly faded when he noticed my expression. "Laura, what's wrong?" he asked, reaching for my hand. I pulled away, hugging myself. "I'm pregnant," I blurted out. The silence that followed was heavy. Paul's face went through so many emotions: shock, disbelief, and finally, fear. "Are you sure?" he asked. I nodded, tears welling up in my eyes. I took 6 tests, and they were all positive. Paul ran his hands through his hair. His eyes suddenly cold, he said, "You need to get rid of it. An abortion, Laura. It's the only option. We're too young for this. It'll ruin our lives." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was Paul, the boy I thought I loved, telling me to get rid of our baby, like it was nothing. "Get out of my sight," I hissed, turning away from him. He left without another word, leaving me alone with the heavy decision I had to make. Telling my parents was even harder. I waited until after dinner when my father was sitting in his usual spot in the living room, reading the newspaper. My mother was knitting, and Julie was there too, standing in the background. "I have something to tell you," I said, my voice shaking. My father lowered the newspaper and looked at me suspiciously. "What is it, Laura?" he asked. I took a deep breath. "I'm pregnant." The reaction was worse than I could have imagined. My father's face turned red as he started yelling about shame and disappointment. My mother burst into tears, crying about what the neighbors would think. Julie just stood there, shocked and disgusted. "You'll get an abortion," my father said. Once he had calmed down enough to speak clearly, "We'll find a discreet clinic. No one has to know about this mistake." At first, I didn't want to listen, but the pressure from my family was too much. A few days later, I found myself sitting in a doctor's office. My mother and Julie sat beside me like guards. The doctor, a kind woman in her 50s, looked over my charts with a frown, then looked up at me, her eyes full of concern. "Laura, I need to tell you something important," she said gently. "Because of your medical history, if you have an abortion, there's a high chance you may never be able to have children again." Her words hit me hard. Never be able to have children again. Suddenly, the choice was clear. "No," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. "I'm not doing it. I'm keeping the baby." My mother gasped, and Julie rolled her eyes, but I stood my ground. The drive home was tense and silent. When we walked through the door, my father was waiting, expecting news. "Well," he demanded, She wouldn't do it. My mother spat, frustrated. After everything we've done for her, my father said, his face twisted with anger. He took a deep breath and then spoke, his voice cold and final. Get out. Pack your things and leave this house. You're no daughter of mine. I won't have you embarrassing this family with your condition. My mother nodded in agreement, her eyes hard. You heard your father. Julie just stood there, silent and judgmental. Tears ran down my face as I rushed to my room, grabbing some clothes and throwing them into a bag. As I headed for the door, my father's voice stopped me one last time. And don't think about coming back. As far as we're concerned, you're dead to us. The door slammed behind me with a sound that felt final and devastating. I was alone, pregnant and homeless. In desperation, I called the only person I thought might help, my Aunt Kelly. She and Uncle Scott had always been the outcasts of the family, living in another state and rarely talking to my parents. Laura, what's wrong, sweetie? Aunt Kelly's voice was warm and concerned. Through tears, I explained everything. There was a long pause after I finished. Where are you now? She finally asked. Outside our house. They kicked me out. Another pause. Stay right there. We're coming to get you. The drive to Aunt Kelly and Uncle Scott's house was long, but it gave me time to think about everything that had happened. Their house was small but cozy. As soon as we arrived, Aunt Kelly fussed over me, making sure I ate something while Uncle Scott carried my bag to the spare room, which would now be mine. It's not much, he said, placing the bag down, but it's yours for as long as you need it. I looked around the small, warm room and felt a lump in my throat. It's perfect, I whispered. The next few weeks were a blur of doctor's appointments, talking about my future and getting used to my new life. One evening at dinner, Aunt Kelly spoke up. We've been thinking, she said. We want to help you continue your education. I looked up from my plate, surprised. What do you mean? Uncle Scott leaned forward. We've saved some money over the years. We never had kids of our own, so we want to use it to help you go to college. I was speechless. After everything that had happened, the idea of going to college felt impossible. I don't know what to say. Say yes. Aunt Kelly smiled. We believe in you, Laura. This baby doesn't mean the end of your dreams. With their support, I enrolled in a local community college, majoring in business management. It wasn't easy juggling classes, doctor's appointments, and the challenges of pregnancy, but I was determined to make it work. I also found a job as a waitress at a local restaurant. The owner, Evelyn, was a kind woman who understood my situation and was flexible with my hours. It wasn't much, but it helped me save for the baby and contribute to Aunt Kelly and Uncle Scott's household. The day my son was born was the most terrifying and beautiful day of my life. After hours of labor, I held him in my arms, amazed by his tiny fingers and toes. Aunt Kelly and Uncle Scott stood nearby, smiling proudly like grandparents. What are you going to name him? Aunt Kelly asked softly. I looked down at my son, peacefully asleep in my arms. Jack, I said. It means God is my judge because, no matter what anyone else thinks, I know I made the right choice. As I adjusted to being a mother, juggling a newborn with college classes and work, I often thought about my parents and Julie. Did they know about Jack? Did they regret what they had done? But I pushed those thoughts aside. I had a new family now, one that accepted and loved me unconditionally. One day, during a rare break, I was scrolling through social media when a post caught my attention. It was from Julie. My heart skipped a beat as I read it. Excited to announce that Paul and I are engaged. Can't wait to start our life together. The photo showed Julie smiling, her arm around Paul. The same Paul who had abandoned me and our child. They looked so happy, like nothing had ever happened. A wave of emotions hit me. Anger, hurt, and betrayal. But then I looked over at Jack, peacefully playing in his crib, and I realized something important. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their love. Everything I needed was right here. The years went by quickly, in a blur of diapers, textbooks, and late-night study sessions. My last semester was especially tough. I was taking extra classes to graduate on time, still working at a restaurant, and taking care of an energetic 5-year-old. Graduation day was filled with emotions. As I stood in line to receive my diploma, I looked into the crowd and saw Aunt Kelly and Uncle Scott beaming with pride. Jack sat on Uncle Scott's shoulders, waving excitedly whenever he caught my eye. The real surprise came later, at the graduation party Aunt Kelly and Uncle Scott threw for me. While we were celebrating, Evelyn, my boss from the restaurant, pulled me aside. "Laura, I have an offer for you," she said with a smile. "I'm looking for a new restaurant manager, and I think you'd be perfect for the job." I was shocked. "Me? But I've only been a waitress." Evelyn waved her hand, dismissing the thought. "You've been so much more than that. I've seen how you handle tough customers, how you organize the staff, and how you balance work, school, and motherhood. That's the kind of dedication and skill I need in a manager." It felt like a dream come true. A steady job with better pay and regular hours. It was exactly what Jack and I needed to start our new life. The next few years were full of positive changes. I threw myself into my new role at the restaurant, learning everything I could about management and business. Jack started school and grew into a smart, curious boy who loved to read and play baseball. It was at one of Jack's Little League games that I met Frank. He was there with his son, Tyler, who was playing on the other team. We started talking, and I was instantly drawn to his kind eyes and easy laugh. "Single dad?" I asked, noticing he was alone. He nodded, a sad smile crossing his face. "Widower, actually. Tyler's mom passed away when he was a baby." My heart ached for him. "I'm so sorry. That must be hard." "It is," he admitted, "but we manage. How about you? Single mom?" I laughed. "Is it that obvious?" Our relationship developed slowly. We were both careful, having been hurt before, and with our children in the picture, we didn't rush things. But as months passed, I found myself falling for Frank. He was kind and patient, and Jack adored him. A year after we met, Frank proposed. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a quiet moment in his backyard with our boys playing nearby. Our wedding was small and intimate, with only close friends and family. As I walked down the aisle, with Jack proudly by my side as the ring bearer, I caught Aunt Kelly's eye. She was crying, but her smile was radiant. Life with Frank, Jack, and Tyler soon settled into a comfortable rhythm. A couple of years after our wedding, we were blessed with another addition to our family. Our daughter, Betty, was born on a warm spring morning. As I held her in my arms, with Frank, Jack, and Ty gathered around the hospital bed, I felt a sense of completeness I had never known before. I loved all three of my children equally. Jack and Betty, my biological children, and Tyler, my stepson. Blood didn't matter. They were all my kids. One evening, Aunt Kelly was over helping with the kids when we were startled by a familiar voice coming from the TV. Their larger-than-life faces filled the screen. My father stood at a podium, waving to a cheering crowd. The ticker at the bottom of the screen read, "Adam Johnson announces his candidacy for mayor." My heart nearly stopped. It had been years since I had seen my parents, even if only on a screen. My father looked older, his hair grayer, but his eyes still had that same stern, determined look I remembered so well. As we watched him speak about family values and moral integrity, Aunt Kelly's face twisted with anger. "Hypocrites!" she spat, her voice shaking with fury. I turned to her, shocked. "Aunt Kelly," she took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving the screen. "There's something you need to know, Laura. Something they've kept hidden for years." "What?" I asked, confused. What she told me next shook me to my core. "Many years ago, before Julie and I were born, your parents had their first child, a boy. But he was born with severe physical disabilities, without legs. Instead of loving and caring for him, they left him at the hospital, too afraid that he would embarrass them. I felt a whirlwind of emotion, shock, disbelief, and a deep sadness for the brother I never knew. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked Aunt Kelly, my voice shaky, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry, Laura. I should have. But after what your parents did to you, I didn't want to add to your pain." That night, after the kids were in bed, I made a decision. I needed to find my brother. With Frank's support, we hired a private investigator. Weeks went by, and finally we had a lead. My brother was alive, and against all odds, he had thrived. He was a successful writer, married with kids of his own. He had been adopted by a wealthy family that had given him every chance to succeed. Meeting him for the first time was surreal. Even though he looked different, I could see parts of myself in his face. His name was Larry, and he greeted me with a warm smile and open arms. "I always knew I had a biological family out there somewhere," he said softly. "I just never thought I'd find a sister." Over the next few months, Larry and I became close. I introduced him to my family, and he welcomed us into his. His wife, Julia, coincidentally, made me laugh, and their 2 children became part of our extended family. 22 years had passed since the day my parents kicked me out. Life had moved on, bringing both joy and sorrow. My oldest, Jack, was now 20 and had just started college on a baseball scholarship. I couldn't have been prouder of the man he was becoming. One lazy Tuesday afternoon, I was scrolling through news articles when a familiar face caught my eye. It was my father, looking older, but still carrying that same air of self-importance. The headline read, "Mayor Adam Johnson discusses family values in an exclusive interview." Curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked on the video. For a few minutes, I listened as my father talked about the importance of family and moral values. Then the interviewer asked about his children. My father's face softened into what I knew as his public sympathy look. "I have one daughter, Julie. She's the light of our lives. Tragically, we lost 2 of our children. The pain never goes away, but it's made our family stronger." For days, I seethed with quiet rage. How dare they erase me and Larry, pretending to be tragic, sympathetic figures, almost as if fate was stepping in. Larry called. "Laura, guess what? I'm doing a book signing in our hometown next week. It would mean the world to me if you could come." "I wouldn't miss it for the world," I told him, a plan already forming in my mind. The following week, I found myself back in the city where I grew up. As I walked through the familiar streets, memories came rushing back, some good, but many painful. I pushed them aside, staying focused on what I needed to do. The book signing was being held in the grand ballroom of the city's most prestigious hotel. As I entered, I realized Larry hadn't been exaggerating. Half the town seemed to be there. Local celebrities, business leaders, and politicians were all mingling, waiting for the event to start. And there, in the front row, sat my parents and Julie. My father, now the mayor, looked every bit the part of a distinguished politician. My mother, elegantly dressed, smiled and nodded at people she knew. Julie sat beside them. They hadn't noticed me yet. I found a seat near the back, my heart pounding so loudly I thought everyone could hear it. Larry rolled onto the stage in his wheelchair to loud applause. He looked confident and comfortable in the spotlight as he began talking about his book and his life. I saw my parents nodding, trying to look sympathetic. "I was born with a severe disability," Larry said. "No legs and other health issues. My biological parents abandoned me at the hospital, unable or unwilling to care for me." I watched my father closely, but his expression didn't change. No recognition, no shame, just the practiced look of a politician showing concern for someone else's story. "It's a sad story," Larry continued, "but I was lucky. I was adopted by a wonderful family who gave me every opportunity to succeed. Still, I always wondered about my birth family, who they were and why they gave me up. The room was completely silent, everyone focused on Larry as he spoke. My heart raced, knowing the moment that would change everything was coming. Then Larry smiled, his eyes sparkling with a mix of humor and determination. "But that's not the end of my story," he said. "You see, I found my family. My sister Laura is here today." He turned toward me, extending his hand. "Laura, would you join me on stage?" A gasp spread through the audience as I stepped into the spotlight. Many faces showed recognition. After all, I had grown up in this town. But the most dramatic reactions were in the front row. My parents' faces went pale, their expressions shifting between shock, fear, and realization. Julie looked like she had seen a ghost. They knew their carefully built image was about to fall apart. My parents stood quickly, clearly planning to make a fast exit. But I wasn't about to let them escape the truth again. "Mom! Dad, please stay!" I called out, my voice echoing through the now silent room. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation, don't you?" My parents froze, trapped by the eyes of the entire audience. Slowly, reluctantly, they sat back down. I took a deep breath. "Many of you knew me growing up. You knew my family. But there's a lot you didn't know. A lot that's been hidden for far too long." And then I told them everything. How my parents had abandoned Larry at the hospital because they were ashamed of his physical differences. How they had hidden his existence, building their reputation on lies. And then history repeated itself. I continued, my voice growing stronger. When I got pregnant at 19, they didn't offer support or understanding. They demanded I have an abortion, even though doctors warned it could leave me infertile. When I refused, they kicked me out, pregnant, alone, and abandoned, all to protect their perfect image. Gasps and whispers spread through the crowd. I saw people's disgusted looks aimed at my parents, who seemed to shrink in their seats. "For years, I've heard them talk about family values and morality," I said, my voice full of emotion. "But their actions tell a different story. They abandoned 2 of their children when we needed them the most. They erased us from their lives to keep up their perfect image." The room erupted into chaos. People were shouting, some at my parents, others at each other. Journalists who had come for a simple book signing were now furiously taking notes or speaking into their phones. In the middle of the uproar, I locked eyes with my father. The man who had once seemed so powerful in my childhood now looked small and defeated. My mother was openly crying, and Julie sat frozen, her face filled with shock and confusion. In the days that followed, the story blew up. It was all over the local news, then the national news. My father's political career crumbled overnight. The man who had preached about integrity and family values was exposed as a hypocrite. His position as mayor became impossible to hold, and within a week he resigned, citing personal reasons. But everyone knew the truth. The college where he had taught quickly distanced themselves, firing him. Amidst all the chaos, one thing became clear. My sister Julie made her choice. She stood firmly by our parents, refusing to face the truth. During a brief phone call, she hissed, "You've ruined everything. Don't contact me again. You're dead to me, just like you're dead to Mom and Dad." But life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. A few days later, I got a call from a number I hadn't seen in over 22 years. It was Paul, Julie's husband, and the father of my eldest son, Laura. "I've been thinking about us, about what happened," he said, his voice hesitant and almost shy. "Julie and I, we can't have children. And I thought, well, we have a son together. Maybe we could be a family." I couldn't help but laugh. "Paul, you made your choice 22 years ago. You left me when I was pregnant with your child. You married my sister. And now just because you can't have children with her, you think you can come back to me? No, that's not how it works." "But Laura." "No, Paul. I have a wonderful husband and a beautiful family. I don't need you, and I certainly don't want you. Goodbye. I hung up, feeling a sense of closure I didn't know I needed. But the surprises didn't stop there. The next day, I got another unexpected call. This time from Paul's parents. Laura. A tentative voice asked, "This is Lauren, Paul's mother. We just found out about Jack. Is it true? Do we have a grandson?" The conversation that followed was emotional and eye-opening. Paul and my parents had told them I'd had an abortion and run away. They'd spent years believing their grandchild never existed. "We'd like to meet him," Lauren said, her voice trembling. "If that's okay with you. Of course, we understand if you don't want us in your lives." I thought for a moment. Paul's parents were not responsible for what Paul did, or for the lies my parents told. They had been deceived too. "Okay," I said finally. "I'll talk to Jack and see if he's open to meeting you." The meeting between Jack and his grandparents went surprisingly well. There were tears, hugs, and lots of catching up. Jack, always kind-hearted, welcomed them with open arms. In the months that followed, life settled into a new normal. Larry and his family became a regular part of our lives, filling our home with laughter and love. Aunt Kelly and Uncle Scott doted on all the grandchildren, biological or not. As for my parents and Julie, I only heard bits and pieces about them. They had moved away, trying to escape the scandal. Part of me felt sorry for them, but I knew I had done the right thing by telling the truth.